Good evening, everyone. This is Pete Huff, Program Officer for the Wallace Center, in charge of the Pasture Project. I want to welcome you all to tonight's webinar, Establishing Optimal Forage Chains for Livestock Grazing. We're joined by Kent Solberg of the Sustainable Farming Association. Wanted to just make a quick note that this is a webinar put on by the Wallace Center and the Pasture Project, and also, as I mentioned, with the support and the cooperation of the Sustainable Farming Association. So I'd like to introduce the great honor of introducing tonight's presenter, Kent Solberg. I've had the honor to work with Kent for a long time and have learned an incredible amount from him. He's the Livestock and Grazing Specialist for the Sustainable Farming Association. Beyond that, he owns and operates an award-winning grass-based livestock farm in west central Minnesota with his wife, Linda. He's got 25 years of experience in planned grazing and pasture-based livestock systems. And for the past 10 years, Kent has been working with a focus on cover crops and seeded annuals and looking at how to integrate livestock with cropping system to improve soil health. Kent is a fairly exhaustive presenter and instructor, speaking regularly at conferences and meetings and workshops around the upper Midwest with a specific focus on organic transitions, forages, cover crops, fencing, livestock grazing and livestock management, and soil health. He's a coordinator for the Minnesota Dairy Initiatives and a master grazer for the Dairy Grazing Apprenticeship. Kent is a tireless advocate and is on the road more often than not. So we're very lucky to have him on with us tonight. So with that, Kent, I will pass over control to you and you can walk us through your presentation.
Well, excellent. Thank you, Pete. Welcome, everyone. Some of you, it may be an opportunity to come out of July heat and cool off a little, and I hope we can make your time worthwhile here this evening. I'd like to talk with you about establishing forage chains for livestock grazing. First, I'd like to define what a forage chain is. I feel it's a systems approach to forage production that maximizes our grazing opportunities. Usually we design this based on an individual farm's goals and resources. And oftentimes we utilize a combination of both annuals and perennials in developing this forage chain. We're not going to be able to hit on every possible example tonight. What I hope to give you is kind of enough ideas to stimulate creativity and think about your own situation and how you can apply some of these principles or some of these options to your operation. Just looking at the poll that Pete shared earlier, it looks like we probably have some people who have some experience in some of these things in our audience, and hopefully we can give you a way to take that to another level. So why would we want a forage chain? Well, grazing is an economical means of harvesting forages. Stored forages are usually the greatest annual cost to most livestock operations. Forage chain can help a producer meeting organic certification requirements, the 120 days of a minimum 30% dry matter intake from grazing to meet the requirements of the NOP. Could be helpful there. Managed grazing is a key component in building soil health. And so if you're doing some cropping work, this could be a huge benefit to you. We do have seasonally variable growth in our pastures. It's not constant throughout the whole season. And so we need to adjust to that in order to maintain performance of our animals. It's a way to reduce manure handling costs. Also, we keep those animals out on the landscape longer throughout the year. That's that much less manure we need to be handling. When we're looking at a 1 million gallon dairy manure pit costing somewhere in the neighborhood of $10,000, sometimes twice a year, to empty and spread that out. That can be hard in current commodity price environment that we're in. And so reducing manure handling costs can go a long way to helping the farm's bottom line. This is a chart just showing variability within our forages. We've got some examples of cool season grasses up front, or on the top, excuse me. We get a lot of production, typically up front in the spring, April, May, into June, dipping down in the summer, and then maybe peaking depending on the weather, again in the fall. Where warm season grasses that are illustrated on the bottom here typically show peak production during the heat of the summer months. Here's my highly exaggerated cool season pasture growth curve, but we'll use this to make a few points tonight, or a few key principles. Again, we have this typically large production of forage early in the season, early in the growing season, with a slump. And I hope you can see my cursor here, with the slump coming during the summer as temperatures increase. And then depending on the weather, we get a bump in forage production early in the fall. Usually in many herds and many flocks, though, we see this increasing forage need throughout the growing season. As those calves, as those lambs are growing, they're requiring more dry matter intake in order to continue gaining throughout that growing season. So we've got this gradually increasing need, but we have this very inconsistent growth, particularly in our cool season pastures, which dominate most of our grazing situations in North America. So we've got a couple of these gaps we want to address. We talked a little bit about the summer slump, but we're also going to talk tonight about extending that grazing season into the fall, and then even looking at opportunities for beginning that grazing season early in the spring. So let's start with spring. Here's one spring strategy that seems to be taking off, particularly in the Midwest. We're seeing more of this. And that's winter annuals, such as cereal rye, triticale, hairy vetch. They're planted the fall before. As things begin to warm up in the spring, it becomes an opportunity to use it as lambing or calving pasture, particularly for those producers that are working to time their lambing or calving about the time these would be ready. The producers that I've worked with and talked to about this routinely tell me it's a great opportunity to get that birthing out of muddy lots and out somewhere clean. They often tell me that one of the great benefits is that the disease issues pretty much go away by doing this. I would encourage you to have a termination plan as part of your plan to do this, if something you're going to do. We'll talk more about some of those things on the 23rd of this month on using cover crops in some of these situations. One of the beauties of this system in the spring also is it gives us an opportunity for other cash or forage crops. Common one is soybeans in the upper Midwest, but it could be a sorghum or millet type or based forage crop for grazing or even for harvest later in the season. Let's move to summer slump. Prescribed grazing or adaptive high stock density grazing or flex grazing, as Dr. Alan Williams talked about in some of the previous webinars that are archived here for your viewing, is a great way to start taking some of the dip out of that summer slump. The rest period allows us for stockpiling for some forages. I work with a number of producers who say they've really kind of flattened out that dip in the summer slump. Some hardly notice it at all on many years if they're doing a good job of managing their forages by grazing. We're building shade to protect the soil and conserve moisture. We're protecting our root structure and protecting those microbes and keeping our forage production up there. One opportunity that also exists is diversifying what you have out there in your perennial forage stand. By diversifying that mix, we also build some buffer into that. Interseeding mid and warm season perennials can be a great opportunity depending on what you're starting with. We also find that as we diversify that pasture, animal performance tends to go up also. I've just listed a few examples here. There's many more. We've got people from all over the country watching this. I'd encourage you to work with forage folks in your area, whether that's NRCS or Extension, and identify some opportunities that might work in your with your soils and in your geographical region. Interseeding warm season annuals is something that's grown in interest and popularity. I think right now we're seeing some of the best success with this in our southern regions. We have quite a few viewers tonight from the southeast, and there's a number of people doing this with great success. I think one of the reasons is you probably experience more of a true dormancy with your C3 or cool season plants than we do in the Midwest. Oftentimes when we have true dormancy in the Midwest, nothing grows. It's either a hot, nasty drought or it's the dead of winter, and so it's a little bit of a challenge. We also see lower success rates with sod-forming cool season grasses in the northern regions, such as smooth brome, Kentucky bluegrass, and quackgrass. We have an established root system there. They're ready to go. They're strong competitors for any nutrients, light, moisture that's available. It's difficult to get warm season annuals and established in those situations. We do have to suppress those cool season grasses in order to get it to work. We can use grazing to do that. We can do haying to do that. We now have some producers in the upper Midwest that are able to use roller crimping when those plants, when the seed heads are formed and they're pollinating. There's an opportunity, just like we would with cereal rye, to roller crimp those plants. I think we have the greatest opportunity for this to do it where we're dominated by one, maybe two grass species, such as smooth brome or quackgrass or both. They tend to mature about the same time, and there's probably a window of opportunity to do this. This is something relatively new that people are experimenting with in the upper Midwest, and I think there's some opportunity to learn here, and it may be something you'd want to experiment with on a small scale. The grazing and haying, oftentimes people start thinking about seeding warm season annuals in this time of year, and I'm starting to believe and see from talking to others that our opportunity to do this needs to start probably 9 months in advance or the fall before. We can have a huge impact on next year's forage production by either stressing or protecting those forage plants in the fall. And a hard graze or a late season haying in the fall, followed by another one in the spring, may be the means to get enough suppression on some of those sod-forming grasses in order to have an opportunity to establish or interseed warm season annuals. Typically, most people no-till the C4 warm season annuals into these stands. Lots of opportunities out there because we've got such a broad range of people watching from across the states here tonight. I'd work with folks in your area, talk to farmers in your area and see what works. Usually it's the sorghums, sorghum Sudan crosses, Sudan grass, pearl millet, things like that most people do. Cowpea, forage soybean, things like sun hemp, things like that. So see what folks are using in your area and go from there. Other opportunities for dealing with the summer slump. Warm season perennial paddocks. Very strong summer growth as we saw on the chart. You may have this opportunity either on your farm or on a neighboring farm. Oftentimes these are native range sites. Or we often see former CRP acres. There were a lot of CRP acres in the 80s and in the 90s that were established using warm season annuals that are now coming out of contract and creating grazing opportunities. These are usually dominated by big and little bluestem, Indian grass, switchgrass, and the like. Careful grazing management can really improve production on these. I have a small area on my farm that has this, and it's pretty amazing what we can do by just shifting our grazing management to promote these warm season annuals. Utilizing low ground pasture. For many people, particularly in the Midwest, this is going to be reed canary grass like what we see in the picture. These are sites that are typically too wet in the spring and early summer to handle livestock traffic. They do need to be able to support that livestock traffic. Animals typically don't like to go out there if it's too wet anyway. It's just too hard for them to move around. These may be sites you can't utilize every year, but when you can, you're probably going to need them, because it's probably dry enough. So we want to take advantage of that opportunity. So think about when you're laying out your fencing or adapting your fencing, how to create some access. Typically, this just means building a gate in a strategic location to access this. We have some of this on our farm, and we have gates in strategic locations that we can access it when the opportunity allows, using portable fencing to fill in the gaps where necessary. Another opportunity that may be out there is harvesting that spring surplus as a stored forage crop. There are producers who do this, and typically they would harvest somewhere in the neighborhood of 30–50% of their, what some people would consider, excess pasture acreage in the late spring. If we get adequate rain and given enough recovery time, we can often come back and graze these in mid to late summer during the summer slump time. I would encourage you to think about, if you're doing this, to rotate which paddocks are cut for hay or haylage on any given year, so we're not doing the same thing all the time, as Dr. Alan Williams talked about in his webinars, kind of scrambling things up under those principles of disruption. And then, if at all possible, if we could feed that stored forage back on those harvested fields, so we're not removing that carbon from the site, but just cycling that carbon back through animals, back to the ground to help those microbial communities in the soil to help build future forage production. So basically, just to illustrate what we're trying to do here is harvest this surplus here and feed it here, or again in the fall, and just being strategic about how we do that to help balance out our forage needs throughout the year. So feeding these stored forages. I would encourage you to be systematic on where we feed them out in order to promote that soil fertility and soil health, as we talked about. Oftentimes these are called a sacrifice paddock. I think that's a misnomer. I think we should call them opportunity paddocks. I think we could look at tools such as part-time hay feeding on some of these paddocks. We can feed what's out there for forage at an optimum time during the day. Dr. Williams talked about feeding during the afternoon hours to maximize the availability of high brix forages in order to get the best animal performance out of there. But maybe that's our only time we move animals onto a paddock during the day. Instead of giving them another paddock at night or the next morning, we would feed hay at that time on a place that needs some fertility. That creates a management opportunity. Maybe buying feed in would be another way to take this to a whole nother level. Instead of feeding things you've stored up, if you can find good quality feed at the right price in your area, buying in that feed, not only you're feeding those animals, but spreading fertility and being strategic about where we do this. I had to do this last summer. We went through a dry period, and my rotation was getting a bit ahead of recovery, and I had to slow it down a little bit. And so I picked a site that we've been struggling with forage production and fertility for a number of years. We put portable fencing around that site, and then for several weeks, the animals were part-time on that site eating hay, and then the other part of the day they were out grazing in a paddock. And so we were kind of getting the best of both worlds, but slowing down that rotation and allowing those other paddocks to get an opportunity to recover, before we came back to them again. Here's another opportunity we're thinking about, and that's reducing livestock populations during the summer slump. Maybe it's bioseasonal calving, where we're placing those dry cows on a different pasture somewhere in July and August to protect a home pasture. Maybe this could be a paddock that was cut earlier for hay. Mixed livestock operations. There's great opportunity here. I worked with a farm one time that had not only sold feeder lambs, but also had a cow-calf operation. And those early spring lambs, about this time of year, middle of July, those lambs went to the feedlot, went to the feeder, and they pulled those animals off their pastures and were able to buy some extra wiggle room for those pastures. Here's another opportunity with some producers I've worked with, and that's weaning those calves early. When we wean the cow, or wean that calf off the cow, she's not going to lactate anymore. We can see upwards of a 30% reduction in the cow's forage needs just to maintain body condition. And that can be enough to buy us the wiggle room we need to get us through that summer slump. There's also potential by early weaning for tapping into a higher market. Oftentimes those feeder calves are worth the most in early August versus in November. A lot of times those 4-weight calves bring a whole lot better money than those 6 or 7-weight calves do. So it's something to think about as an opportunity out there, and protecting our pasture resource. Seeded annuals, another opportunity here, other than seeding them into perennial pasture. This could be used as part of a broader crop rotation on our tillable acreage. We have a number of commodity producers out there. Here's an opportunity that might work. I think a lot of times people are used to referring to these as cover crops, just another name for the same thing. I do want to point out there are what are called single cut forages, such as grazing corn and forage sorghum, and multi-cut cover crops, such as Sudan grass, pearl millet, and teff. These can be cut or grazed multiple times, and I just say that so as you're planning and thinking how you might want to use this in your system, to be aware of that as you build your cover crop plan. I would encourage folks to think about a multi-species blend, and we'll dive more into that as we go. Just a couple pictures of seeded annuals used for summer grazing. Yes, those are adult cattle out there in that stand of pearl millet that was seeded about 35 days before. So there's tremendous growth opportunity in the right weather conditions. It's something that can be used as part of a broader rotation and an opportunity to give those pastures a longer rest and recovery period and get some great quality feed off of it. One of the advantages of a multi-species blend or polyculture is just the sheer durability of this. We have lots of data now about how powerful this is. This slide really illustrates that. This is a 29 species cover crop mix that was planted in the end of June. And from the time it was planted until this picture was taken in the end of August, where these cattle are grazing on it here, this site actually only received 0.4 of an inch of rain. And temperatures the week prior to this, and even the day this picture was taken, were at or near 100 degrees. That's a lot of stress. Our cool season pastures certainly aren't going to be looking like this the end of August under those sort of weather conditions. But these complex cover crop are very resilient systems and have an opportunity to produce a tremendous amount of forage for us even under adverse conditions. As Dr. William talks about, the rule of threes as we're designing cover crop blends: 3 grasses, 3 legumes, 3 broadleaves. And I have some examples listed here. Doesn't mean these are the best or worst or favored over something else. It depends on what your goals are and what your resources are for that particular field. These are just some examples to kind of get you in the ballpark of what we're thinking of. But the rule of threes, good place to start. Another good thing to follow is if you have a history of cool season plants on this site. Let's say it's a site that's been in grass legume hay for many years. Think about emphasizing warm seasons in that complex cover crop mix. And conversely, if there's been a history of warm season crops, such as it's been in corn and soybean rotation for a long time, think about emphasizing cool season plants in that complex cover mix. Also consider what your subsequent crop is. For example, if your subsequent crop is going to be sunflowers, probably don't want to include sunflowers in your complex cover crop blend. If this is something new to you and you feel a bit challenged by the idea of putting a complex cover crop blend together, I'd like to point you to the Smart Mix calculator available through Green Cover Seed. It's free service that they offer. I'd encourage you to get familiar with that, and we're going to talk more about that on the 23rd on using this for designing blends, but it's fairly user-friendly. One thing I would point out if you're developing a forage mix is target 140 to 145% of the full seeding rate. Their default is 125. Not necessarily bad, but if we're looking for forage and forage production as one of our primary goals, we may want to look at a little higher seeding rate as we build those blends. So we've talked a bit about spring and even the summer slump. Let's move to extending that grazing season into the fall. stockpiled perennial forage is a great way to do it, and a great opportunity, particularly for dry cows and ewes. This is something we can move towards by using adaptive high stock density or flex grazing, as Dr. Williams talked about. In some parts of the country, there are producers that are able to graze most of the way, if not all the way, through the winter by just doing a good job of managing their grazing and building that stockpile of forage. Some people are, if you're working with performance animals, you may want to, like stockers or dairy cattle, you may want to test your forages to know what you're dealing with out there, or at least early on, so you can get a feel for what's going on out there for you, depending on what you have out there for perennials. This is something we need to plan for fairly early in the grazing season. It's not something we can do at the last minute. So it's, as you're putting your grazing plan together, think about that. Oftentimes these sites, these paddocks, are set aside in mid to late summer and allowed to grow to their maximum potential through the fall. Maybe this could be something that happens after a first, second, or even third crop hay, depending on what part of the country you're in. Usually these are sites that are grazed after a killing frost, for those of you who have such a thing. We do want to leave residue to protect the soil. That's going to give us the most bang for our buck, particularly in the future. Leave plenty of residue out there, to protect that soil and provide opportunities for the microbes. Typically in northern latitudes, we see 1 to up to 8 weeks of grazing opportunity with stockpile perennials. In the south, this can be through much of the winter. Even in states like Missouri, we have producers who are getting through much of the winter on stockpiled perennials. If covered with snow and ice in our northern latitudes, this can be a great opportunity on where you're going to start grazing the next spring. All is not lost if it gets flattened by a heavy wet snow or ice. Just that's where we're going to move things ahead come next spring when thaw comes. So stockpile forage quality, this is often a question. I don't have a lot of data on this, but I do have a little data on this. We went out on a pasture that had some stockpiled forage after a couple killing frosts in October 26th of 2015. There was about 10 inches of growth there, so it wasn't a lot, but there was enough to get something out of it. And so we pulled a forage sample out there. Our total digestible nutrients ran about 62, which is better than the suggested amount. Our 30-hour neutral detergent fiber was running about 63, so we're looking pretty good there. Net energy for lactation was at 0.54, which is a little bit on the low side, so I don't know if it's going to be the best dairy quality feed out there, but our RFQ was still up there around 70, so there's great opportunity here. Even after a killing frost, we can still have some pretty good quality feed out there, if nothing else, for replacement heifers, for dry cows, for dry ewes, things like that. There's a great opportunity here well into the winter season. Here's another opportunity for extending the grazing season, and that's grazing crop residue. Most common of these is going out into corn stalks after that corn is combined. Pretty common in the upper Midwest where we have cattle and row crop operations together. One thing I would encourage you to think about is checking herbicide restrictions to see if there's anything you should be concerned about there. Remember, the label is the law. We want to limit feed this to avoid any potential for bloat or acidosis. If the grain cart took the corner a little fast, we spilled some grain, the hopper was a little full on the combine, and we spilled some grain, we don't want a couple of those cows to go out and find that pile out there and get themselves into trouble. So usually we strip graze this or limit feed to avoid those animals loading up by finding those corn, all that corn on day one. As you can imagine, and as you probably are aware, corn stover is pretty coarse feed, not very high protein, so we want to feed a quality protein supplement with that. Most common is good quality alfalfa hay. Typically, this is offered on the path back to where the animals would go for water. Another option is interseeding with a cover crop. This could be something like crimson clover, annual ryegrass, brassica, winter wheat, something like that. We do need timely rains to make this work, and there's some tricks to making this work, and we'll talk more about that on the 23rd. We could also graze volunteer cereal grains, oats and wheat. The combine often usually doesn't get everything, and we can have some pretty good growth under the right weather conditions to get some volunteer growth after those cereals. And we could even sweeten up the mix a little bit by following that combine with a no-till drill and adding some brassicas, maybe some lentils or winter peas in there and filling in some of the gaps. Just an example here of gleaning crop residue, cattle out on corn stalks. Usually we do this with portable fencing. Here's an example of an interseeded cover crop that was intentionally planted for grazing in the fall, and this field was grazed. That makes a pretty nice ration right there for the cows to go out on something like that, and they perform very well in a system like that. Another opportunity, we've already talked a little bit about seeded annuals and seeding them in to make a better quality ration in corn, again, often known as cover crops. But this could be a whole field that's seeded specifically for extended season grazing in late spring or early summer. This can often be done after first crop hay, or one of the greatest opportunities out there we're finding now in the upper Midwest is seeding after a small grain crop. Multi-species blends are encouraged. Again, the rule of three, 3 brassicas, 3 legumes, 3 legumes, 3 grasses, 3 broadleaves. And then I'd encourage you to think about strip grazing these, taking somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 50% and leaving the rest for soil health. Again, we need to watch our herbicide restrictions on any herbicides that were applied to the previous cash crop there. Something to watch for and be aware of and worth doing your homework on. Here's just an example of a multi-species blend that was seeded after small grain harvest and cattle out there in October enjoying that. Here's a multi-species blend that was put in after first crop hay. This is a great opportunity. We've been doing quite a bit of this in the upper Midwest, where we have a hay field that a producer is interested in renovating. And so we'll take first crop hay off and then terminate that stand and come in and design a complex cover crop blend for either late summer or late fall grazing. This happened to be a 10 species blend that was seeded in. And then this producer came in November and early December and picked up 5 weeks of grazing for his cow-calf herd off this blend. The next year, typically what we do is go in with a nurse crop, a multi-species nurse crop, for example, of oats, barley, field peas, or oats, spring wheat, field peas, something like that. Seeded with that would be our new perennial either hay or pasture mix. The beauty of this is we're getting typically 2 crops every year off these sites, so we don't lose a production year. It's a great way to stimulate some other microbes in the soil by getting some warm seasons in there. We could even mix up the rotation even more. This particular field here, the next year, he grew a corn crop in there the next year before going back to a perennial hay crop. So there's that opportunity also. It adds a lot of flexibility to our management. It's a great way to extend the grazing season and get lots of forage for our cattle and help keep some of our production costs down in the future. And oftentimes we're seeing a pretty good bump in forage production on the subsequent forage crop following something like this. There's something about stimulating those microbes that really seems to pay off downstream from this for several years. Double cropping, here's another situation. This is just a row crop situation. This producer wanted to diversify his rotation. And so in the spring, he went in and planted oats, barley, field peas He does have a beef herd, and he did take this off as baleage for his cattle, and then he followed that with a 14 species complex cover crop mix. This picture was taken in middle of November, and it had froze a couple times, and there was a question as to what was the forage quality out there, because the day we took this picture is also the day he started to bringing his cattle into this field and grazing. So we pulled a forage sample, sent it into the lab, and you'll see the numbers on the bottom of the screen there. We ran an RFQ of 179, neutral detergent, 30-hour neutral detergent fiber of 62, net energy for lactation of 0.68, total digestible nutrients of 65. Folks, that's dairy quality feed. We could have kicked the jerseys out there and they would have made milk on this. This is in November in a northern tier state with a multi-species cover crop mix after multiple frosts, and it's still excellent, excellent quality forages. One of the beauties of these multi-species mixes, particularly when we blend in things like corn, sorghum, sunflowers, the millets into this, is if we get snow on this, what the animals will do is they'll start with the plants sticking up out of the snow, start working their way down, and then find some of the goodies that are buried down under the snow. So it's an excellent opportunity. We tend not to lose it, even under heavy snowfall in the winter. The animals find it highly accessible. And we have producers in northern tier states now often grazing mixes like this well into January and February. I would encourage you to think about strip grazing this. If you look to the left, well, the strip right in front of us was the last 24 hours. To the right, the animals were just moved into a new strip, and the strip to the left was the 24 hours prior to that. But we're working to leave a lot of residue on the ground here to protect the soil and feed those microbes. Kind of the rule of thumb here is graze the best and trample the rest. Give the animals what they want, but get the stuff they're not so interested in down there to protect the soil and build not only soil biology but fertility for future crops. It's this trampling that's going to feed the microbes, and that's just a ground shot of something that's trampled, including some manure deposition that you can see there. Yes, there's some feed there that might still be edible, but we got to feed that underground livestock also. Here's what makes this really sing, modern fence technology. And if you join us again on the 23rd, we're going to talk more about the infrastructure to make this happen. If you haven't built fence since with Grandpa Bob back in 1977, things have changed quite a bit. We have some excellent opportunities out there to really make this work for us and create some wonderful opportunities, not only for livestock production, but also for building soil health on cropland. Here's another opportunity for season extension grazing, and this is swath grazing. Canadians in the western provinces seem to be kind of masters of this. Usually we're looking at something like an annual like triticale, oats, wheat, or annual ryegrass, but sometimes it could even be stockpile grass if we've got some good quality stuff out there. These annuals, if we're using them, are often planted midsummer and allowed to grow into the fall and then cut with a swather in October, sometimes into early November, depending on the fall. The cattle are able to access these swaths in relatively deep snow. 18 or 20 inches of snow isn't even too much a problem for them. And it's much easier for those animals to access these swaths than it is stockpile grass if they happen to get flattened by snow or even ice. We're finding this is most commonly used in the greatest success in the colder and western regions because it kind of preserves forage quality for us. I know this has been done as far east as eastern Minnesota, and maybe there's some in Wisconsin or Michigan. We've done some of this. I'm not aware of that, but would love some time to hear of your success stories if you're doing it farther east than eastern Minnesota. Typically, we strip graze these swaths and just give the animals what they can eat in 1 to 3 days. Those are kind of the rules of thumb. Gives you don't have to be out there every day moving that. We can adjust if the weather's going to be bad or if we have to leave the farm for a couple days or something. So it gives us some flexibility to do that. So here's a picture of what the swaths would look swaths look like when they're cut. And then here's the animals grazing them out through the snow, and you can see they can readily find those through the snow when we give them access to those. I also want to touch on outwintering or bale grazing. This may not necessarily fall within some people's purview of grazing, but I think it's an excellent opportunity to keep animals out on the landscape, and bale grazing is kind of an intermediate way to do that, or outwintering. I define outwintering as the systematic feeding of livestock during the winter to enhance soil fertility and forage production. And I think the key thing here is this is systematic. It's not random. We're trying to accomplish specific things on a specific piece of ground. Bale grazing is the most common way this is done. Lots of producers out west in the upper Midwest and up in the Canadian provinces do this. Even down in the southeast, I know of producers that have done this during the winter months. Bales are, in this case, we have dry hay bales that were placed, out on a very specific piece of pasture, usually in the late fall or early winter. And then the animals are only given so many bales at a time using portable energized fence. So we're being very specific here about how we do this. Those bales are rationed out. This is a great way to kill two birds with one stone. We can feed animals and spread manure at the same time. This particular producer here, where this picture is taken, spends one long afternoon in the fall placing all of their winter feed out on the paddock they want to bale graze on, and they're done. They don't have to start a piece of equipment to feed animals the rest of the season. And we have a number of producers doing this in the northern tier states. They absolutely love it, because if you've never had the experience of trying to start a diesel tractor at 35 below zero, you may not appreciate the value of this. Usually animals are given the bales they can eat in anywhere from 2 to 5 days, with 3 or 4 being the most common. So it gives a lot of flexibility to the operation to go do other things. There's a number of ways to do this. And Pete, this is probably maybe a plug for a future webinar, is just a whole webinar on different techniques or what producers have found to work for them, to make bale grazing work for them, because there's some differences. There's own opinion and techniques to do this, but it basically accomplishes the same thing. It's just what works for you and what you like for your operation. Another opportunity is systematic feeding of your TMR right out on the snow. There's 90 dairy replacement heifers being fed here, just starting into a new paddock here with a fresh line of TMR. They're fed TMR once a day. In this particular situation, yes, you do have to start up machinery every day. You can see they've already been across this area here, so they're coming into a new paddock to be fed. So they're fed once a day, and then there's usually a couple bales placed out if anybody gets a little shorted on the TMR. But one day it's fed here, then the next day move over. In this particular situation, it was to the left for the next feeding on a clean patch of snow, and then the next day, and then the next day, working all the way across that, and then coming back and working to our right, doing the same thing. Unfortunately, I've lost my picture of this site that was taken in March when the snow melted that year. But talk about a beautiful spreading of manure. There's not many mechanical manure spreaders that could have done a more even job of spreading manure out there. It was pretty amazing how beautiful a job it did. So it's another opportunity that may work for you with something like dry cows or dairy replacement heifers. A great way to get those animals out there and spread manure and feed them all at the same time. Just a quick picture of what oftentimes it looks like post-bale graze. The nice green lush stuff in the foreground is as this site is recovering. You can compare that to what's going on in the background. And this is well into the fall. The grass is starting to go dormant in the back, and yet it's still lush green growing in the foreground here because of that extra fertility. So typically we see the greatest production the second year after we bale graze on the site, but oftentimes, depending on the activity of the soil microbes, we can see tremendous production the first year, and oftentimes that'll last for multiple years. Here's an aerial shot of a farm that's been bale grazing for 4 years. So we've got a paddock here, a paddock here, and a paddock here. 4 different paddocks that have been grazed on. I know this farm, and I know this is a sandy knoll back here, gravelly knoll, very low fertility on this site. And so they're coming back after 4 years. So year 5, they're coming back to where they started here, and they're going to bale graze again on this paddock over on the right here. And what they do is they place all the hay that they're going to feed into that paddock during the summer, during the haying season. They place it all on that paddock, and then they just use portable fencing to keep the cattle out of it until they're ready to spread it. So it's right there. It's very easy to access. It's very easy to get distributed across that paddock, and it just takes a short amount of time. But you can see the results. All these little circles in here are where the extra fertility was from bale grazing, and on this particular piece of ground, we're seeing it out 4 years. I know producers on better quality ground are seeing the benefits of it out 5, 6, 7 years where they've been doing bale grazing. So just a nice Google Earth shot here of what potential we have and what we can see the results of some very good job of systematically feeding out on a particular piece of ground for specific objectives. So here's just a summary chart of different times a year to kind of get your mind around when some of these techniques might work for you. Now, I didn't pick a particular latitude or region of the United States here. I kind of covered a little bit of everything. We do have folks running perennial pasture just almost 12 months of the year. And that's great. Kind of a wide window for some of these, depending on what region you are in the country. But you can see we can look at some of these things, whether it's cereal rye or a warm season cover crop blend or grazing cornstalk residue or maybe some oat triticale type cover crop blend after a small grain, and then even outwintering hay or using those opportunity paddocks in the summer during a drought when we can go in and start filling in some of those gaps that we see on our typical cool season pastures, and even warm season pastures we have gaps too, and filling in. This isn't every opportunity that's out here, but it's just to give you kind of a visual on what some of our opportunities may be. And you could certainly chart this out for your own farm. There's good information available through Extension in the upper Midwest. We have the Midwest Cover Crop Council charts that you can use, and you can map this out for your own chart or your own farm and see where your gaps might be in forage production and what some of your opportunities might be for filling in some of those gaps and creating that forage chain. So just real quick in summary, I encourage you to think about your goals and what are your available resources out there to take advantage of any opportunities you might have on your farm, and maximize that grazing potential to help keep costs down for your operation and keep your profitability looking good. So with that, thank you. And Pete, we'll turn it back to you and see if we have any questions.
To kick us off, Kent, there was a question that came through specifically around, I believe, the photo that you showed around the hay stand. And there was a question about whether it's recommended to terminate the hay stand with herbicide before establishing, or if you could interseed into the hay stand, and what might be the strengths and weaknesses of either approach.
Yeah, great question, and I'm glad you brought that up. Usually if we're going to renovate a hay field or a pasture, we would terminate it. For many people, that's going to be an herbicide termination after haying. If you're an organic system, obviously you can't do that. Probably going to have to look at tillage to do that. I'd encourage you to think about terminating that stand, though. We're probably going to get the greatest response by that subsequent warm season cover crop that we put out there, and it's going to help prep the site for reestablishing a perennial forage out there in a subsequent year.
Excellent. Thanks, Ken. Next question is about what no-till drill have you had the best luck with when on sod and or on crop ground?
My personal experience on sod has been either a Great Plains or John Deere. Other people have had better success with some of the other ones, like a tie on crop ground. I check with producers in your area, but that's what I've seen. The Great Plains and the John Deere seem to rise to the top more often than not.
Excellent. Another question that's come through is in regard to seed, and the question is there an advantage to locally sourced seed for cover crops or pasture improvement versus, I'm assuming, non-locally sourced?
Yeah, I've seen that several times where seed that's produced closer to the source tends to perform better, and that's kind of a rule of thumb. Even in print, from way back in some just basic agronomic practices and establishing perennials is trying getting your seed source as close as possible. They're more adapted to your climate and probably more likely to perform better.
And a question that kind of builds off that a little bit, Kent, is there was a question regarding the multi-species cover crop and the rule of three that you had mentioned. And if there was a question about, are there some species to avoid or some that are maybe better to work with if you're just starting out with seeded annuals?
Yeah, you may want to think, if you're just starting out, I would encourage you, especially in the northern tier states, we have this thing called winter, and it's a great terminator for so many of these annuals, and that makes life really, really simple and really, really easy. Instead of being concerned about something that may overwinter, that you would have to think about another termination plan. So if you're a beginner, think about things that are going to winter kill for you if at all possible, particularly in the northern tier states. There's a cover crop seed company a few years back here. One of their reps told me that they had a slow day one day, and they sat down and identified 150 potential cover crop plants for use across North America. Now, that doesn't mean all of them are going to work in your situation. Some may work better in southern regions and other work better in northern regions. But the point being is there's just many, many, many options out there. I talk to producers in your area and see what they're using, visit some field days, talk to some folks who are doing it, go to some workshops, find out what they're using, what they like, and then start plugging in those into the rule of three to get you there. It sounds a little daunting, 3 of this and 3 of that, and 3 of the other thing. Actually, once you get going on it, it's pretty easy to fill that up. That Smart Mix calculator, if you go on there, one of the things it will ask you, and we're going to go into more of this on the 23rd, is to identify not only your geographic region, but also what your goals are. And when you do that, it'll give you rankings, and it'll give it's their preferences, their experience, their recommendation, but it'll give you rankings of different covers in different categories that you may want to select from, whether they're excellent, good, marginal, or poor. And it almost takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. It's pretty easy. And there might be something on there you don't recognize. And if you don't know much about it, you may want to do a little bit of research on it. The Midwest Cover Crop Council website's a great way to go do research on that and find out, is this something that's going to winter kill in my area, or is it going to carry over in the winter and I need to think about another termination plan? So again, use those resources that are there, talk to some people in your area, see what they're using. If you do get winter in your area, think about what's going to winter kill. If not, think about a termination plan and talk to people, see what they're using for termination. Most commodity producers are using an herbicide burn down, and you can tie that in with your current herbicide program. It's not too complicated. You just got to think that through in advance. But use what's easiest early on and learn and go from there.
Great advice. Thanks, Ken. Staying in that same question, another question that came in from the audience, again, in regard to cover crop, the question is, what are some of the best cover crop blends for low wet soil in your experience?
Oh my. It depends on if it's drying out or not. If we're talking about, some of the, for example, in Iowa, southern Minnesota, we've got a lot of drowned out areas, or what people are sometimes called prevent plant areas. They do need to dry out so we can go get in there and do the work. Those can be particularly challenging just because we can't get in them. So it kind of depends on the degree of wetness. Is it something we want there for the long term, like a perennial thing, or is it something we just want as an annual? And we can lose a lot of these annuals if the wet comes back. So it is a bit of a gamble, but typically if we have something that's wet in the spring, a prevent plant type area, and it dries out, it kind of now depends on what time of year it is also. How late are we into the season? How many growing degree days do we have left? What do we want to use that site for in the fall? Is it just something to keep the ground covered and help those microbes along and protect the soil and keep erosion to a minimum? Or are we going to actually use it as livestock feed? And is it something we think we can use in the fall? So we've got to ask all those questions up front. And then look, can we physically even get in there depending on how wet it is? So my best answer is it depends out there. Really wet, we're probably going to lose a lot of them. But if it's something that is wet and dried out, then we might need to start asking some of those other questions to see what might fit and what might work.
Great. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here on you, Kent. There was a series of questions that have come through around bale grazing. And the first one that came through is asking, is there a percentage of hay savings to be found by using hay feeders during the winter if you're using the bale grazing electric fence method that you highlighted?
We could get 4 people in the room or online right now who all bale graze, and we'd start quite a discussion around that question. Most producers have to figure out what's going to work for them. Typically what I have seen, first of all, most producers, not all, most producers ration out how many bales those animals get for a specific number of days. There are some producers who do the free-for-all. They place the bales out there, they remove the twine string, they remove the net wrap, they throw the gates open, and they come and check on the cows, weeks later. It depends on, how much labor you want to put into it. It depends on your goals. It depends on your tolerance level for how much hay is left out there. There are producers who use bale rings. There are producers who don't use bale rings. Typically what I've seen is if people are feeding 50 head or less, give or take a little bit, oftentimes those are the producers who opt to use bale rings because they're typically only moving 3 to 6 bale rings. And they don't want to be out there moving every day. There are other producers who maybe are feeding several hundred head. Most of those typically do not use bale rings. Number one, it's a labor issue. Number two, it's a cost issue. You can drop $300, $400, $500, $600 per bale ring. And to have enough bale rings to feed that many head, it's like, that's a lot of money. But another thing I think is kicking in there when we start having a large number of animals out there is sort of that mob mentality where there's that perceived competition between animals, and in their little cow brain, they think, hey, I better get my head down and eat, or I'm not going to get anything. And I think to some degree that's true. And when we start crossing, give or take, that 50 cow threshold, a lot of that's kicking in, and people find that, you know what, it's just not worth me messing around with bale rings. Now, some people still do it, out to 100, 150 head. It's totally your call. You're going to have to experiment and see what you work with. But if we had 2 or 3 different bale grazers in the room right now, you get very strong opinions one way or another. I encourage people to learn as much as they can about bale grazing and about some of the techniques about how they do it. Talk to some people, go look at their operation, watch some stuff online. There's some YouTube videos now online about this, even some good time-lapse photography ones. You can see how the animals respond in different scenarios. Are they using bale rings or not? A lot of people start with bale rings because they're concerned about perceived hay waste, and a lot of them after excuse me, 2 or 3 winters just drop it because, you know, it's just more work than I want to do. I'm doing this because I want to make my life easier. So start with what you're comfortable with, start with where you're at. I don't know that if I was doing 500 head, if I'd go out and spend a lot of money on bale rings. I think I just used, you know, that mob mentality, limit feed. They're probably going to do the job you want out there, and you'll probably be happy with that. But you got to work with your comfort level and what resources you have available to you.
Following on from that, Kent, that response, there was another question about bale grazing, and the comment is that from the photos that you share, it looks like the bales in the bale grazing are turned up on their end for cattle access. And the question is, does this degrade the quality of the hay throughout the winter because of increased exposure to moisture?
Yeah, they're actually turned up on end to remove the twine strings in that particular situation, or so for some people it would be net wrap. Most people wait as late as they can, kind of watching both the short and long-term forecast before they place these out. Usually in the northern climates, it's in cooler weather. So even if we do get some rain on that upturned end on that bale, we don't get a lot of decomposition out there. If anything, it's going to collect it and freeze. Some people opt to, they want the bale on its side so it will shed water, but they need to remove the net wrap, bale wrap, or twine string before they do that so they can get it off. So those cows don't, you know, ingest it or get entangled in it. So you got to decide what's right for you. I've seen people do it both ways. A lot of producers just want a one and done thing. I'm going to put it out there, so all I have to walk out there with is you know, ride the quad out there, the snowmobile. Some people take snowshoes or skis out there, whatever. They take a knife, they cut the twine strings or bale wrap off, move the poly wire, and away they go. And they don't want to mess with starting machinery. So it's kind of your choice. Again, we could have 2 different bale grazers online right now talking about this, and you get 2 very different opinions. But a lot of people do the upturned bales just to access removing the material holding the bale together, and they find they don't have a lot of problems with hay wastage or hay loss or spoilage if they're putting them out. Typically in the northern tier states, it's sometime in November.
Thanks, Kent. And to balance that out, we have a question from someone in the southern tier states. And the question is, what are the benefits of unrolling hay versus bale grazing, especially given, you know, their location in the southeast?
Yeah, we have people who unroll hay in the north too, and for specific reasons, because they want that fertility placed out that way. They're going to go out and feed those animals anyway. They're trying to get manure distribution that way. But one of the big advantages of unrolling bales, whether you're in the south or the north, is typically people are only unrolling what those animals will consume in a 24-hour period. So you've got less chance of a pile left behind there, and most people are doing that on ground they intend to hay the next year. Sometimes when we're bale grazing, we get some clumps behind and it's difficult to hay that ground the next year. The second year, it's just not a problem. So what most people do the first year after bale grazing is they graze it. And then they save the haying until the microbes have just decomposed the leftover hay. But if it's crop ground, if it's ground they're going to hay, typically they're unrolling in those sites. Sometimes it's an access issue where, like, let's say it's a slope. They can't get on that site to place those bales, but they can certainly line them up at the top of the hill, cut the twine strings, give them a kick, and down the hill they go. And they get some added fertility on that steep slope in the winter and use animals to do there where they can't get in there with equipment. So both south and north, we have people unroll. Again, how you apply outwintering in its many variations, and it's quite the spectrum, totally depends on your goals and what you're trying to accomplish and what are the resources to help you do that.
Great. Thanks for that, Kent. Another question that's come in is asking about that. You mentioned the soil microbes, that soil life, and kicking those into gear. There was a question about the effects of using herbicides and what that might mean in terms of soil microbial activity or populations.
Yep. That's the $1 million question. It's often the dilemma. And, there's trade-offs to so much of what we do in agriculture, whether we do tillage, whether we use herbicides, whether we apply fertilizer, whether we graze, whether we don't graze, whether we do or don't do any of the above. And we each have to make our choices based on our values, based on our goals, and based on our resources. Obviously, if you're in an organic situation, you have some restrictions around you there. But there are implications to all that stuff. I think there's an argument to be made for acute versus chronic use of any of these tools. These are all tools available to us in our bigger agricultural toolbox. And if we're chronically using something, if we're continuously grazing a site, if we are tilling a site 3, 4, 5 tillage passes every year, year in and year out for 30 years, if there is no rest or no break in there, that's a chronic situation, and that's a recipe for trouble. But if it's an acute situation, if it's something we're doing once in 10 or 15 or 20 or 25 years, I think our system's got some resiliency built into it that we can recover from that. We're finding that tillage is very, very detrimental, particularly to mycorrhizal fungi. And it's really a dilemma for people who are in organic systems. How do we handle this conundrum of tillage to, for example, terminate a stand or even cultivate our crops when it is so detrimental to soil microbes? And there's people working on that. There's some techniques that have been developed to help move us beyond that. And there's some great people and great minds working on it, and some great resources out there. And it's something to look at and think about. But again, all of these things have compounding and cascading consequences, as Dr. Williams talked about in his previous webinars. And we have to weigh the cost and benefits of those in each particular situation. And I think if we look at acute versus chronic, particularly to get to that herbicide or even a tillage situation, it's a little easier to digest. Unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world. Oftentimes, if you are concerned about using a termination technique such as tillage or herbicides on a stand of perennials, maybe we just need to adjust how we're managing that through grazing, haying, or whatever. Maybe the application of some manure, maybe changing our stock density out there can help us meet our goals. Those are other tools that are in the toolbox. And if we have concerns about fertilizing with synthetics or using synthetic pesticides, we can take those things off the table and move forward that way. Again, these are complicated things. It's a complicated biological system. There's no true right or wrong answer, only in each of our own eyes. There's a spectrum out there. We have a spectrum of tools available to us, and each of us has to make our own decision based on our values, goals, and resources.
That's great advice, Ken. Thanks for that. We have time, I think, just for one more before we want to wrap this up. This last question comes from one of the audience members who's a beginning grazier that was asking about making the determination between a swath paddock and using that for winter feed versus bale grazing, and how to make the determination when thinking through paddock planning when one might be more appropriate than the other.
So usually bale grazing is often done on a paddock that's probably already been grazed that year. And oftentimes people who bale graze will feed, it may be something that was hayed, and like we talked about, you're going to feed back out there. But a lot of bale grazers are importing feed to that paddock. They're importing nutrients because they want to build fertility. In a couple of those pictures that I showed with outwintering, particularly the bale grazing one, that producer imports the lion's share of their hay. They buy it, they import it because they want to bring fertility on there. If you've got, if you're flush with pasture and flush with feed, and you plan on stockpile grazing well into the fall, but you want to protect some of that in case you get an early snow. Like, for example, last November, we had a foot of snow the middle of November, and it flattened everything. That feed was no longer available to my cattle. where if I would have had it in swaths, it would have been available to them. So if you're awash with feed and you want to take some of the risk off that stockpiled feed and swath a portion of that stockpile feed in case you get an early ice storm or an early snow so that it's still available to the animals, that may be a time and a place to use that on perennials. Oftentimes, swath grazing is used on cropland. They'll grow an annual there and then swath it as a way to get fertility out there and get some more mileage out there. But when we go to the expense, the cost, the labor of baling that, it adds a cost. And so by swathing it, that's the beauty of it, is we're reducing a lot of that material handling costs and even the potential for moving that manure around if we're going to bring it back into a lot and feed it. So those are some things to think about. What's the site? What are your goals there? What do we want to do? Do we want to improve fertility, and are we buying hay anyway? Let's be strategic in where we feed it, use bale grazing or one of the outwintering techniques to feed it. But if we've got all perennials and we're awash in stockpile grass and we want to hedge some of our risk there a little bit, maybe swath grazing or swathing a portion of that to protect it in case we get an early winter event that would make that stockpile grass available. That may be a trigger to help us think about when we'd want to do something like that.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kent. That's all the questions that we can take on now. We're getting close to the end of the webinar, so wanted to say thanks to all those that submitted questions. They all were very insightful, and hopefully everyone else who listened in got something out of those questions. And also thanks to you, Kent, for that great presentation and for answering those questions on the fly. You never know what you're going to get in the Q&A, and you were able to handle all those seamlessly. So thanks for all the knowledge and information in the presentation and the Q&A. I just wanted to offer a few reminders that we mentioned at the top of the webinar. Importantly, we have the upcoming July webinars that are happening starting next week and continuing on every week through the end of July. You can register for those at the pastureproject.org/events website and get yourself on that list. Again, next week will be contract grazing. The following week will be Kent again talking about planning and infrastructure for cover crop grazing. And then the following week, the final Monday of the month, we have Megan Filbert from the Practical Farmers of Iowa, who's going to delve into some of the economic considerations for grazing cover crops. So again, sign up for those, and also stay tuned on that website and on future webinars. We will continue to announce future ones that are happening. We do have some happening in August that are going to be focused more on more of the logistics and the marketing side of pasture-raised livestock and pasture-raised products. So stay tuned for those and join those as you're able to. Wanted to pass on thanks to all of you in the audience, and also a particular thanks to Kent for sharing such great information tonight. My name again, Pete Huff with Pasture Project. You can email me there at the email address on the screen, and happy to answer any questions, providing the support that we might be able to. And also, Kent's information is up there as well. So feel free to pass on emails to him with any specific questions about the presentation or about SFA's great work in general. And you can visit their website, sfa.mn.org. SFA has quite a library of great resources and great upcoming events and their chapters throughout the region of the Upper Midwest.